The clock stopped in Pripyat at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986. When reactor number 4 blew apart, thousands were evacuated overnight and the Soviet authorities cordoned off roughly 600 square kilometers, turning whole towns into a frozen archive of ordinary life interrupted. There are strollers still sitting in empty apartments. Toys lie on classroom desks, the Ferris wheel in the amusement park waits in silence, and plaster peels from hospital walls. Small, specific scenes that explain why the exclusion zone feels like a photograph you can walk through. Radiation didn't disappear with the people. It soaked into soil and buildings, turning the red forest copper, and that's why engineers built a huge steel arch over the ruined reactor and why scientists walk the streets carrying dosimeters, measuring what's still dangerous and mapping where nature can safely return. Nature moved in where people left. Wolves, boar, lynx, and herds of horses now roam through decayed blocks and overgrown boulevards, creating a strange trade-off between abandonment and revival. And in the next minutes you'll see the sights, hear the stories, and get a clearer picture of what 17,000 days of silence have really done to this place. 1. On April 26, 1986, an accident occurred at Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There was a quiet tension in the control room that night, a routine test scheduled between shifts that should have taken minutes but stretched into something else. On April 26, 1986, Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was running a planned safety experiment to see how the turbine and backup systems would behave during an outage. The reactor was an RBMK-1000, a large graphite-moderated, water-cooled design that responded oddly at low power levels. Operators reduced power for the test, and the plant's behavior moved from predictable to unstable. People in the room tried to follow procedures, and small choices added up fast. When power dropped too far, xenon buildup made the reactor sluggish, so engineers withdrew many control rods to restore output. That left the core in a precarious configuration. The RBMK's positive void coefficient meant that as water turned to steam, reactivity increased instead of falling, which amplified the problem. The emergency shutdown, AZ-5, was ordered, but the control rod's graphite tips initially displaced coolant and caused a sudden spike in reactivity instead of the expected instant drop. The tension broke into violence. A massive power surge produced a steam explosion that blew apart the reactor vessel and destroyed the building's upper structure. The exposed core and hot graphite caught fire, and radioactive material lofted into the air in a plume carried by wind across the surrounding countryside and beyond. Radioisotopes such as iodine-131 and cesium-137 were among the contaminants released. Firefighters who arrived first attacked visible flames on the roof and around the turbine hall. Many received extremely high radiation doses while trying to contain the immediate blaze. After the blast, the mood shifted to emergency improvisation and grim calculation. Helicopters dropped sand, lead, and boron to try to smother burning graphite and absorb neutrons, while crews worked to douse secondary fires and cool intact systems. Workers and engineers, later called liquidators, were mobilized to build a concrete and steel enclosure, a temporary shield to limit further emissions. Nearby residents, including those of Pripyat, were evacuated hours to days later as authorities assessed contamination patterns and tried to prevent further exposure. 2. Radioactive contamination affected large territories and triggered evacuations. There was a hurry of buses and a stunned silence as whole neighborhoods emptied out after officials detected dangerous levels of radiation near populated areas. The city closest to the reactor, home to about 49,000 people, was evacuated in a single day, and those people left almost everything behind. That immediate movement was a direct response to airborne and deposited radioactivity that made living there unsafe. Authorities prioritized moving people faster than they could collect belongings. The effect was instant: homes abandoned, schools shuttered, and a whole local economy frozen in place. You could see the contamination in the land itself, where dust and particles settled on roofs, fields, and forests and turned familiar places hazardous. Winds carried radionuclides well beyond the immediate plant neighborhood, so officials had to draw a broad buffer zone and then expand monitoring even further out where fallout patches appeared. The most obvious local sign was a swath of woodland that turned brown and died, later bulldozed and buried because the soil and trees held intense radioactivity. As a result, whole tracts of agricultural land were taken out of production, and food controls like milk and meat bans were put in place to stop contaminated food from entering markets. People were moved again and again as surveys refined the maps of contaminated territory. Tens of thousands were taken from nearby towns first, and a much larger cohort, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were later resettled from outlying villages and districts once measurements showed long-term contamination of soil and waterways. That displacement broke ties to land and livelihoods. Farmers lost fields that could no longer be safely worked, and communities dissolved as schools and clinics closed. The cause and effect was plain. Radioactive deposition on the ground meant land use ceased to be safe, and people had no option but to relocate. The landscape of the exclusion zone today still reflects those evacuations and the decisions they forced. Access is controlled and monitoring continues, because while overall radiation decays over time, hotspots remain where materials concentrated, and natural events like wildfires can loft particles again and cause local spikes that trigger temporary restrictions. Some contaminated material was removed and buried, and entire buildings were sealed, but large areas are simply off limits and remain a physical reminder of how radioactive contamination can turn inhabited territory into enforced emptiness. The human follow-on is tangible. Villages that were planned for gradual return never recovered, and a small number of people who returned on their own live with the trade-off of proximity to home and ongoing exposure risks. 3. An exclusion zone with controlled access was established around the site. There's a strange tension the moment you reach the first gate. Everything looks like a road into a quiet countryside, and then suddenly there's a checkpoint with guards and a metal barrier. Entry is controlled by Ukrainian authorities, and you must show ID and an official permit to pass. At the main northern entrance, for example, staff check passports and scan people with handheld dosimeters before letting them through. Because of contamination risks, that basic screening determines who can go in and how long they can stay. Beyond the gate, the area is divided into zones with different rules, and that separation matters in practice. Some places are open to escorted visitors for short routes. Pripyat and parts of the town centre are common stops, while others, like the Red Forest or the immediate reactor perimeter, are off limits or require heavy protective measures. The high radiation patches force guides to stay on defined tracks. Wandering off the road or picking vegetation is forbidden because soil and plants can carry hot particles. Those strict pathways are a direct response to detected contamination patterns, so the rules reflect real measurements. Access is also differentiated by purpose, not just by geography. Scientists and engineers receive long-term passes because they need prolonged work cycles near containment structures, while most contractors come in on scheduled rotations with strict time limits. Local elderly residents who returned, often called self-settlers, live under a different informal arrangement and have to navigate checkpoints and delivery limitations that most visitors never see. Journalists and foreign researchers typically arrive with pre-approved documentation and must be accompanied. That accompaniment both protects visitors and limits unauthorized activity. Practical controls are visible at every stage, and they serve a clear function. Vehicles may be checked and, if necessary, lightly decontaminated. Personal dosimetry logs track accumulated exposure for workers and long-term visitors. Radiation monitoring stations feed data back to managers who tighten or relax access rules based on actual readings. The result is an environment that can look permissive at a distance but is enforced by layers of permits, patrols, and monitoring to keep people safe and to prevent the uncontrolled spread of contamination. 4. Over time, work inside the zone continued under regulated conditions for operations and research. There is a steady, low-key tension at the checkpoints that control entry to the zone, and that tension shapes everything that happens inside. Access is strictly regulated. Only people with permits and specific work orders go in, and every entry is logged and monitored. Workers wear personal dosimeters that record accumulated exposure and pass through decontamination portals on exit. Because radiation levels vary across the landscape, teams coordinate with real-time monitoring to plan who goes where and for how long. A constant hum of heavy machinery and remote manipulators marks the engineering side of the work. Large structures around the damaged reactor are stabilized and monitored continuously, and engineering crews use long-reach cranes and shielded containers to move highly contaminated debris. Where direct human presence would cause unacceptable doses, robots, cranes, and manipulators take over, transmitting visual and radiological data back to control rooms. Those engineering choices, remote handling, containment, and shielding, reduce risk and make more complex operations possible. Scientists set up arrays of instruments and take regular samples, and those data drive practical decisions. Teams run gamma spectrometers on soil cores, sample groundwater from boreholes, and deploy automated stations that log air activity and weather conditions. Ecologists maintain long-term plots to track vegetation succession and population studies of mammals and birds, while radiobiologists study cellular and genetic markers in collected specimens. Findings from these studies feed into remediation strategies. such as where to focus soil remediation or how to design water protection measures. Work inside the zone follows tight health and safety choreography, and that choreography has evolved with experience. Shift patterns, medical exams, and radiation protection rules keep individual doses within regulated limits, and occupational health specialists adjust protocols based on monitoring results. Training is continuous. Technicians, engineers, and researchers learn to interpret instrument readouts, recognize hot spots, and use remote tools safely. The result is a functioning, regulated environment where decommissioning, waste management, and scientific research can proceed without abandoning practical safeguards. 5. The zone remains a symbol of the disaster and a case study in long-term territorial consequences. A ring of checkpoints and fences still slices the landscape, roughly matching the perimeter set aside decades ago, and that visible border says as much about current realities as it does about past decisions. The exclusion boundary exists because contamination patterns left whole swathes of land unsafe for normal use. Monitoring stations, guarded access points, and the massive shelter over the damaged reactor are concrete reminders that the area is managed rather than abandoned. That management creates a persistent jurisdiction, land that cannot be farmed, built on, or freely inhabited in the ways neighboring regions are, and those restrictions ripple through planning, budgets, and local lives. Walk through the trees and you see nature moving into human absence, and the contrast is sharp. Forests have grown back across villages where roofs collapsed and streets cracked, but not all regrowth is the same. Some patches, like the area known as the Red Forest, were killed by fallout and remain hotspots because radionuclides bound tightly to the soil there. Mushrooms and certain game species concentrate cesium, so hunters and foragers must be cautious even where the landscape looks healthy. Fires that sweep through contaminated woodlands can loft radioactive particles and redistribute them, so a single blaze can undo decades of localized containment and force new rounds of monitoring and temporary evacuations. People lost homes and livelihoods, and the territory has been reshaped socially as well as ecologically. Some former residents stayed in small numbers, living in villages that are outside formal resettlement programs. Others were relocated, changing demographics and breaking local economies. At the same time, the zone has become a place for specialized work. Teams of engineers and waste managers operate storage facilities and maintain the shelter, while researchers study long-term ecological and health effects. Guided visits and controlled tourism bring a different kind of attention and income, but they also require strict regulation to prevent unintended exposure and to protect sites of ongoing remediation. Those visible and invisible consequences make the area a textbook case for thinking about long-term territory management. The persistence of long-lived radionuclides means decisions stretch across generations, so mapping, continuous monitoring, and layered governance are not optional. International collaboration on containment and on monitoring technologies, from ground sampling to satellite vegetation analysis, helps translate complex contamination patterns into actionable plans. The result is a landscape that functions as a living laboratory and a cautionary symbol. Land altered not just for months or years, but for decades and centuries, demanding policies that balance safety, science, memory, and the realities of people who still call parts of it home. You can still see the rusted Ferris wheel in Pripyat. Because the reactor exploded in 1986, the area was evacuated and left to time and nature. Abandoned schools and apartments, the Red Forest scorched and still radioactive, a hastily built sarcophagus later sealed by the new safe confinement, ongoing scientific monitoring, returning wildlife, and slow, costly cleanup efforts that turned a single event into decades of consequences. It's easy to feel distant from those facts. But when a former resident remembers the last night before evacuation, or when you learn how thousands of liquidators poured concrete and scrambled under a radioactive sky to contain the worst, you see how displacement, health risks, and a broken ecosystem are threaded into real lives and everyday objects. Packed suitcases, empty classrooms, the names on memorials that make numbers personal. Curiosity doesn't end when the credits roll. For anyone who wants to go deeper, there are survivor interviews, declassified reports, radiation maps, and peer-reviewed studies, plus documentaries and field research that together reveal the science, the policy choices, and the human stories. Following those sources changes what we notice about risk, responsibility, and how societies respond to catastrophe. There's more ahead. In the next episode, we'll look closer at long-term health studies, the surprising comeback of wolves and birds, and the technology, drones, satellites, and new sensors, scientists now use to map contamination and plan remediation, so you can see not just what happened, but how people are studying, adapting to, and learning from the exclusion zone today.